still burning ashes in shame. Wind still whisper, old voices remain. But the foxfire's coming, it's lighting the way. In the dark of the past, we won't stay. Hands in the dirt, hearts full of ache, pulling at the chains that refuse to break. We're building a south where no one bows, where the fire in the hills meets the fire in our vows. Foxfire rising under the night sky, burning out the lies that kept us high and dry. Brick by brick, the old walls fall away. Time to rise and start a new day.
And welcome back to the Foxfire Dispatch. I'm Liz Purvis, and this week we're going to be diving into an important race for the future of justice in North Carolina. My guest is James Whalen. He is a lifetime North Carolinian, a former state DOJ attorney, and now a private practice lawyer. He is also a candidate for the North Carolina Court of Appeals primary next year. James believes our appellate courts must do more than just adjudicate. They need to protect the rule of law, they need to safeguard our rights, and they need to ensure that our democracy works. On his website, he writes, "Years of fighting for that brighter future in court have convinced me that we only have one path out of darkness. We must reform our state appellate courts." In our conversation today, we'll explore his motivation for running, what reform looks like in practice, the stakes here in North Carolina for North Carolina voters, and how this judicial race connects to the broader political and generational moment. And at the end, we'll get fun with a lightning round of this or that. All right, James Whalen, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today? Thank you for joining us.
Doing pretty well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Getting the last autumn feeling in the air here before winter sets in, and it's really nice. Let's go ahead and start at the beginning. You're running in the Court of Appeals race. There's going to be a primary in March of next year. What pulled you into the race?
Yeah, so it really started for me. There's a long story and a short story. I'll give you the short story first. I'm one of the attorneys that helped Allison Riggs defend her win earlier this year. I think we'll probably talk about that quite a bit today. I'm very proud of that work we did. There's a lot of nights and weekends and holidays to work through to make sure that we were able to get her across the finish line and make sure all of our votes counted. But the reason it took so long is because the state court of appeals was willing to throw out thousands of votes, including thousands of military votes, and undermine the results of a free and fair election. And when the smoke cleared after helping Justice Riggs, it was obvious to me we needed a whole new approach. We needed a long-term plan to try to defend our rights and the rule of law. And it couldn't be bouncing from crisis to crisis. We needed a new generation to step up and run for these court seats, a generation who could win and who understood the moment we were in. And that's what I was looking for. There's an open seat. It's an 8-year term, so it's an opportunity for somebody new to get in and make a difference over the long term, not just by being a great appellate judge, but also recruiting and training and encouraging a whole new generation to win that court. And so it was an opportunity, and I got a lot of early encouragement, and I jumped in.
Very cool. Well, you already got a head start on my next question, which was going to be to ask you more about the Allison Riggs case and arguing that, what your experience with that was like.
Yeah, so we started the year before. So in 2024, a group of people got together in North Carolina and realized that based on what happened in 2020, there's a pretty good chance that if the presidential election was close, then the Trump team would, and the RNC and so on, may try to use the legal process to undermine the results of the election. They had tried that in basically every state where Donald Trump lost in 2020. And if it ended up being close in North Carolina, we wanted to be prepared. So we got together early in 2024. In fact, I think it was Christmas of 2023, And I know that because we ended up having a hearing on the 27th. The judge was, I think, a little annoyed about all the lawsuits and started calling everybody in right after Christmas to make it clear that if we were going to litigate these things, we were going to be there in person after Christmas. So that was sort of the start of it. And over the course of 2024, the Republican National Committee and various other entities in North Carolina filed 5 different lawsuits to try to change the election rules before the election. And so we fought that. And then we, going into the end of 2024, I was tasked with bringing together attorneys from all across the state, knowing that a lot of these election challenges end up being at the county board of elections level. And we have 100 counties. So there's no way for a few attorneys in, Charlotte or in Raleigh to try to cover everything. We needed attorneys who practiced all over the state to be on board, to be trained, to be ready to go at a moment's notice. And that took a lot of planning. So we did all that work. We had this coordination. We were ready. It turns out that the presidential election was not particularly close, but the Supreme Court election was, and there were about 4 legislative races that were also very close. And so we went to bed election night, pretty depressed, woke up the next morning, and, my personality and the personality of my colleagues, we woke up, and one option is to bury your head in the sand and say, it's disaster, it's all over. I think for us, we woke up and said, we've been putting in all this hard work all year. It's not what we thought it was going to be, but Allison Riggs needed our help. And there are a number of legislative candidates who need our help too. They had won their races. They had gotten more votes than the other candidate, but they were being challenged using the same playbook that we had been fighting against all through 2024. And so we called up, Allison Riggs had her campaign had its own attorneys, but we called them up and said, we've got this, army of attorneys that are well-trained and ready to go. We know the playbook because we've been fighting it all year. We need a project in order to keep us motivated and engaged and defending democracy. So how can we help? And law firms don't always work well together, but I was very pleased that all the firms worked well together, and it took about 6 months, but we were able to get Justice Riggs across the finish line.
Yeah, that feels both so recent and so long ago. And yeah, I remember 2 of those legislatures are 2 of mine. Brian Kahn and Terrence Everett were part of that challenge. And it was a little touch and go at the beginning of the year. Will they, won't they?
Yeah, it was a good experience
Yeah.
to see the state in a way that I'm from North Carolina. I've lived here my whole life. But even if you've been in North Carolina your whole life, you don't necessarily know the whole state. And it was an opportunity for me to drive to every community, essentially, into the Board of Elections, which is often in some small municipal building downtown. And a group of anywhere from 5 to 50 concerned citizens would be there, confused about why the election was still in question. And then the Board of Elections would have to have a hearing, and we'd be going through person by person to say, is this person allowed to vote? Is this person allowed to vote? And it was my job to make sure that people who followed the rules and were allowed to vote were respected and had their rights count. And so, drove up to defend Terrence and Brian, all the various counties. I was back and forth to my hometown of Charlotte quite a bit for a very complicated contest down there that alleged a whole bunch of students essentially tried to challenge the right of students to vote. And so I had to go back and forth to do that and defend them. It was Wilson, North Carolina. It was a lot of different places that we needed to rush in at the last minute and make sure that the votes that were lawfully cast were counted. We were able to do that. Then we ended up in state and federal court, and that's what made it drag on so long. But it was a neat way to experience the whole state.
Yeah. I know that you have mentioned before that you've also argued in front of the Supreme Court, and I was wondering if you would tell us about that case or cases or experience generally.
Yeah, so before private practice, I worked for the State Department of Justice under Josh Stein in what's called the Solicitor General's office, and that's the office that handles the complicated appeals. And so this might be a good time. I don't always assume knowledge. There are a lot of different ways to approach the court system. And in North Carolina, there are essentially 2 different tiers. There are trial courts, which is what you see on television, right? You have one judge, you have a jury, you have attorneys arguing about evidence, and then win or lose, there's an opportunity to go up on appeal to a different set of courts. And in North Carolina, there's a court of appeals, which is what I'm running for. It's a statewide court with 15 judges. And then above that, if you don't like the result in the Court of Appeals, you can ask for review by the Supreme Court, which has 7 justices. And that's what Allison Riggs is on. Anita Earls is running for re-election to the Supreme Court this time. And so in my previous job in the Solicitor General's office of the Department of Justice, our job was to take the case once it was up on appeal, whether that was in state court or in federal court. And so I can give a couple of different examples. I have argued cases. I was the attorney to stand up and argue the case in the state court of appeals, in the state Supreme Court, and then more recently in private practice in federal appellate court. The case that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court that I worked hardest on was called Moore v. Harper, and it was a big gerrymandering case. And essentially the argument from the legislature was that they were allowed to gerrymander even if that meant breaking the state constitution, because what they were doing was somehow immune from state constitutional review, that state judges couldn't put any limits on the legislature's ability to gerrymander. And that question went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. I did not argue that one. I was one of the junior members of the team at the time. We had a former U.S. Solicitor General, one of the top attorneys in the country, I think out of California or Seattle, came and argued on behalf of the state government. And there are a number of other very qualified attorneys who argued that case. But I got to work on the case. I did research and writing on our briefing, and we won out in a tough court. I mean, this is a relatively recent case, and so it's the current Supreme Court that heard that case. If you know anything about our current U.S. Supreme Court, you might think, putting restrictions on gerrymandering is not something they've been willing to do. But in this case, we were able to get 6 of the justices to agree that state judges have the ability to limit state gerrymandering. And that was a really important decision because that left open the door for North Carolina judges and justices to do their job and protect voters from gerrymandering.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. I cannot imagine what a unique experience it's got to be as a jurist to engage with the Supreme Court with the current makeup that it has and the current very unique Swiss cheese pick your own ideology kind of thing that seems to be happening with some of those justices. It's wild. I worked at UCLA Law in admin doing the law journals a while ago now. But Elena Kagan came to visit UCLA while I was there, and it was during the Kavanaugh hearings. And we, got to go and see the students hear her talk, and she would not even answer a question about what her process was like because of him going through his and how pointed that got and heated that got. It was just really interesting to hear her talk about all sorts of things, but then really just steer clear of the pressing thing at the moment. Obviously a lot of reasons for that, but just the U.S. Supreme Court is just such an interesting. It's going to affect everybody's lives so intently for the next generation before we're able to make any meaningful difference there. It feels like. So I know we've talked a little bit about that. We've talked about some of your work with the state DOJ. It seems like the work with Allison Riggs and the voter protection stuff has been really integral to why you're running for the Court of Appeals. What other bits of your background do you feel like really have pulled and shaped you into running for this seat?
Yeah, well, for this, I'll dig all the way back to high school, I'd say, maybe even before. But, growing up, I come from a big family of public servants. So there was no real question if I'd try to do some kind of public service. It was about what kind and how did my skills line up. And I like math and I like teaching. And so I thought I was going to be a math teacher. I enjoyed that in school. But when I was in high school, that was right around the time that the Republican legislature started really cutting education funding. It led to a bunch of my favorite teachers got fired. The school was in need of repairs that never came, and I got organized with some of my friends and we were able to advocate for teachers and for students. And I found that my role as an advocate ended up being where I fit best. And so that has stuck with me, that for me, education sort of is front and center in who I am and why I do what I do. Even if not every case I work on involves the schools, a lot of them do. And, now I'm a dad and I got a 4-year-old who will start kindergarten at some point. And I'm very mindful that we need to build a school system that will be better for him than it was for me. And in fact, it's worse. And most people know that. Anybody who has any interaction with the school system, we have fantastic teachers who are hardworking, but they are not well supported. And the schools themselves need repairs, and we need more bus drivers and field trips and all those things. And most people who have interaction with the schools know that. What you might not know is that that's a court problem. The state constitution guarantees to every child what's called a sound, basic, uniform set of public schools. That's what the Constitution guarantees. And there's a whole long line of cases that says our legislature is obligated to provide our children that level of funding. But for more than 30 years, the state has not met that obligation. And right now, in the state Supreme Court is a case questioning, if the state doesn't provide those resources, does the court have any ability to fix that? And when the Supreme Court was controlled by Democratic justices, they said, yes, of course, the court has an obligation to protect our rights, including our children's right to fully funded public schools, and a trial court ordered the state to move the money. That's almost $1 billion a year, billion with a B, almost $1 billion a year that a trial court said has to come out of the bank account of the state and go to our kids to fill those holes that we all see in our interaction with our schools. And that is just central to me, both because of my background, because of my wife, who was a middle school counselor for 6 years, and I saw firsthand what she went through as a young school employee, and now thinking about the future for my own family. We absolutely need judges who value our schools and have the courage to stand up for people's rights, even if the state government isn't doing what it's supposed to do there.
That makes sense to me. And also part of what you're talking about was like Leandro, right?
That's
The Leandro ruling. But there's another part of this that's like for those 30 years the state, the legislator has abdicated this responsibility. It's been up to the counties and the city, like mostly the counties, to make up the difference. But that's rampant inequality, right? That's like, Durham does good and little Granville's got Eisenhower era buildings that still haven't been replaced.
We lived in Lee County for about 6 or 7 years.
Mm.
That's where Sanford, North Carolina, which is the geographic center of the state. They are very proud of that. And my wife was a middle school counselor, and the starting pay is so low that, just as you're saying, the counties try to supplement it with some kind of county tax system that raises property taxes to try to pay our school employees. And the difference between Lee County, which is a hop, skip, and a jump south of Raleigh, and Wake County was, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was $10,000. That the same person could move, just a few miles up the road and make $10,000 a year more. So what did that mean? It meant that Wake County was able to draw the best teachers, from all over the state, and concentrate them here. So if you live in Raleigh, that's great. But if you live in one of the surrounding counties, you really struggle to compensate for that. And in fact, what ended up happening is that the property tax rate in Lee County was higher than the property tax rate in Wake County. But because the housing prices in Wake County are so high, the home values are so high, Wake County ended up with way more money to pay its teachers. And so the state constitution says a uniform system of public schools. But what's happened is that because the state has backed off and starved our public schools of resources, the individual counties have had to pick up the slack. And if you're in a wealthy county, sometimes that works out. Although even then, I think even our wealthiest counties, I'm from Charlotte, I could tell you for sure that Mecklenburg could use additional resources for its schools. But even if you come from a county like that, you have access to these things that folks in counties in other places, because you can't raise property taxes high enough to offset what's been cut. And so little things like, again, some of the schools in Lee County, a third of the students were native Spanish speakers, and the school didn't teach Spanish. It wouldn't teach any foreign languages because they couldn't afford to hire a foreign language person because they had to hire enough math teachers to meet state requirements. And so it's just, we're struggling for the bare minimum, and we can't be reliant on the bare minimum in a country where more and more and more education is central to being prosperous. And the Constitution, this isn't just a policy issue, it's a legal issue. The Constitution talks about our public schools. And ultimately, the question is not even really about, is this amount of money right? Is this amount of money right? It's about whether courts are going to stand up for our kids or not. It's the same question as President with gerrymandering. Not, is this map okay or is that map okay? It's whether courts are going to play a role in protecting our rights at all. There are some judges who want to protect our rights and some judges who do not. It's pretty much as simple as that.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing like the lens through which you're viewing these education issues in North Carolina as legal issues, and like as an abdication of responsibility to, like accurately interpret the state constitution. It seems like the language is pretty plain and clear there about that fair and free education. So this conversation for me is making clear a lot of why like the Court of Appeals is important and is an important like bulwark for North Carolinians. How are you making this race seem like as meaningful as it is for the folks who you're asking to vote for you?
We've had a lot of early success, and I think people more and more are seeing, not just in North Carolina, but across the country, that it's judges who provide that last line of defense for our rights. And judges don't always have to play that role when our rights are, sometimes we've taken our rights for granted, that you have the right to free speech. You're allowed to protest peacefully, that if you are arrested, you're given the opportunity to provide evidence that you didn't do whatever they accuse you of. That's called due process, that there is a process through which you go, that you have the opportunity to defend yourself. There's, a long list of these rights that for a long time we've just sort of taken for granted. But in this moment, we've seen that they can't be taken for granted. They're very important, and it's judges who protect them. So we see that all across the country. That's on people's minds. And so when we talk about these judicial races, I think now more than ever, people are plugged in and they're starting to understand how important they are. And then we talk about the types of cases that come to our state appellate courts. One of the things that's important to remember is that the Court of Appeals is a statewide court. So when it makes a decision, it applies to the whole state. It's not like the local court where it just applies to that case. So whether you are in the case or not, you might not be the parent suing on behalf of your kid to make sure your kid has adequate resources. But if another parent sues and the court holds that they're not going to provide resources, your kid doesn't get those resources either. If another voter sues and says, I want my vote to count, I followed the rules, and the court says, you're right, you followed the rules, but we're going to throw out your vote anyway, your vote gets thrown out too, even if you're not in the case. That's how appellate courts work. It applies to the whole state, and those decisions apply forever unless they are reversed or overturned. And so a decision made today could govern my son when he's my age. That's often how these things work. Courts move slowly. And so a decision today could still be in place, 30 some years from now, or 40 or 50 or 60 years from now. And that's why it is so important that we elect people who are able to do that sort of long-term thinking. Someone who has done that type of appellate work and understand the consequences of those decisions, not just for the immediate case, but that apply for everybody and apply long-term. That's not a type of thinking that all lawyers are involved in, let alone, all people who are not lawyers. But appellate attorneys and appellate judges really have to think that way. And that's the type of work I've done. And I think that is a good thing to bring to the bench.
Very, very cool. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we started talking a little bit about generational change, like with the court. And you are very much part of like a new wave of judicial candidates, a youthful wave of judicial candidates. What is the role that you see generational change playing in like our court system?
Yeah, I mean, I think age does matter because I think depending on where you are in your life's journey, you have different experiences. If you bought your first home 30 years ago, you have a different life experience than somebody in our generation who's either just trying to buy a house now or recently bought a house at the height of COVID, which we did, and our interest rate is terrible. And it's not just the interest rate, but the housing prices are really high. And so being in that experience, regardless of where you are and income brackets and so on, I think that lends itself to a different outlook on some of these issues that come before the court. Whether you have kids that are about to start public schools is another good one. If your kids are grown and they're no longer in public schools, you may still care very deeply for our schools, just have a different experience than somebody who's at the front end and someone who, graduated from North Carolina public schools that were affected by the legislature, the Republican controlled legislature. I was still in high school when that started. And so I have an experience that I think a lot of our sitting judges don't have when they're addressing issues like this. In addition, it's also about perspective, and it's not necessarily age, but it's about when did you start your interaction with the law as an attorney and then as a jurist. And, I sort of see the Bush v. Gore decision as an important line. If you went to law school before 2000, you started your legal career before 2000, I think it was pretty fair at that point to say, judges don't wear blue robes or red robes, they wear black robes, that every once in a while there's a decision that's political, but for the most part, the role judges play is in the background. It's narrow. It does not impact our democracy that much. That obviously changed dramatically in 2000, where the Supreme Court intervened and decided the presidential election. And, however you put up a decision, you have to acknowledge that it was monumental shift in how people perceive the courts. And whether it's the Citizens United decision that invited so much money into politics, or the Shelby County decision, which changed the way the Voting Rights Act works. There are just so many ways that our federal and our state judges have directly inserted themselves into the way our democracy functions. And now more and more they're being called on to make decisions how our democracy functions. The Allison Riggs case, the fundamental question in that case was whether or not you can change the rules of an election after the election is already over and then punish the people who didn't follow rules that weren't even in place when they voted. Right? That's a legal question. One I think most of us thought was already resolved and didn't need to be reopened. But the courts were brought into that. And just the fundamental fabric of how our country elects its leaders and how those leaders make their decisions are now thrust on the courts. And if you have grown up in that world, like me, and you've litigated those cases and you've been involved in those decisions as an attorney, then you have a different perspective on the role the court needs to play, and you have a different perspective on how you need to campaign to voters in these races. I think, Allison Riggs, Anita Earls, those two justices have shown us that you can be true to your values, but also be pretty clear with voters about the damage that the current judges are doing. And the brighter future there is if we have judges that are fair and will uphold the rule of law and care about the people in their courtroom. And so you don't have to be a young guy to have those perspectives and those values. But I do think that having been involved in these tough cases at any level and sort of being immersed in that, I think there's a reason that the generation coming up now, millennials and I guess it's Zoomers, and I don't even know, I think my son's a Gen Alpha, so I don't know, I have no idea what.
Yeah, I think millennials are not up and coming anymore.
But at least in the judiciary, they're not on our side of the aisle in the judiciary. They're not a ton of millennial judges. And I think that, building that up, I think there's a reason that millennials and Zoomers and one day Gen Alpha have these perspectives on the way that the law should work and the way that the law should protect people. I think that has something to do with the way we grew up, and that perspective is lacking from our courts. And I think it's important that we start building a new generation who are able to win these races and are able to bring that perspective to court.
That makes sense to me. I like that. It's a flawed analogy these days, but like it was always surprising that like the generation that read Harry Potter and learned all the things about like how we fight evil and defend good and how everybody's equal and we defend like and all of her transphobic shit aside, the ethos that I think that like YA books taught our generation is like, of course we care deeply about a sense of justice in the world, real quick, where'd you go to high
East Mac.
school?
Go Eagles.
Okay. I went to Freddie Ford
Okay,
up in
yeah.
Hickory.
I was in the marching band and we traveled quite a bit. So we may have come to y'all's football field and marched around for a little while.
Nice. We were really proud of our marching band program. I was a clarinet man. Those were, marching band was good years. 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
I mean, I found it very formative to my perspective on things. It was kind of like you were saying with young adult novels, but and this is again not necessarily generational. A lot of people of multiple generations played instruments, but marching band, you got to work hard, you got to take practice really hard, and you also have to fit in with a community of different sounds, and everybody's got their own part to play. But those parts have to be woven together in a way that makes beautiful music and looks cool on the field and wins you some big tall trophy. And I think that a lot of people in this country wish that our country worked more like that, where people sound different, but those differences mesh together into something beautiful and not try to play loudly over top of each other in something ugly. And so I think we can all learn something from being in the marching band.
My old marching band instructor, Mr. Neely, would love to hear that. He would be delighted. Were you trumpet or trombone?
I started as a trumpet player, and then I got braces, and so I switched over to a baritone, which you I'm sure know, but for our listeners is basically a fat trumpet. There's a mini tuba version that you play with in your lap if you're sitting, and then if you're marching around, it's like a fat trumpet. But it was fun, and the mouthpiece is bigger, so it made it easier when you have braces to play it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's delightful. Thank you for sharing that. That's so fun. Hey, there are folks in like marching bands in high schools who are like 18 or will be 18 before November of 2026. How are you working to engage some of these young voters? We know these judicial races typically have low turnout. We know that these young voters typically have low turnout. How are we turning them out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a central question. And again, I'm going to count young voters as people from 18 all the way up to, almost 40. Because what we've seen in the past several elections is that the conventional swing voter, I think, has morphed. And younger people who are pretty frustrated with both parties, because basically our entire lives, the two-party system has failed to deliver the type of leadership that our country needs. Not in every single term, but in a lot of terms, the two-party system isn't working for us. And so they're willing to try out both, right? They're young enough that they haven't plugged into one or the other ideology. They have a variety of views and ultimately just want people who understand what they're going through and are willing to provide that leadership and take those steps necessary to protect our rights. And so, I think that we're bringing that message directly to people and finding them where they are. I think when I talk about my high school or middle school and elementary school experience, that's something that most people don't hear. I remember very vividly the drills we went through to protect ourselves from gun violence, because it was, we had to be prepared. That's not something everybody in this country went through, but those of us who are younger remember what it was like to do that day in and day out. I remember, what it's like when my favorite English teacher lost her job because she was the newest and there had to make budget cuts. Had nothing to do with her performance. It was because she just happened to be new and they didn't, the school had run out of money.
Last in, first out.
Exactly. And that was not fair. And I think that experience is shared by a lot of people who are, in maybe the 18 to 35 age range. And talking about those experiences so that the voter knows we got something in common. And when I go up there and making decisions as a judge, I'm going to be doing it from the perspective of somebody who understands what that younger person's life was like. I think that really matters. We're just talking about things plainly, not trying to dress them up in sweeping language about democracy and impartiality, independence, neutrality. They're good words, but people need to know what they mean to them. And so I think talking about things directly is helpful. And then all the stuff that everybody talks about, we're on social media. I've got a very limited TikTok audience, but we're building it up. So if you're listening to this, find us on all the social medias, trying to provide information to people about our courts in bite-sized pieces that they can consume, when they're trying to get from their first job to their second job, something that they can take with them and understand, and then share that with other people in their lives to get more involved. I do think we've seen across the country, younger people, when motivated, can play an incredibly important role in our elections. And that can go both ways. And so making sure that we aren't just taking for granted young people as, the foot soldiers in these political arguments, but are people who need to be persuaded, and persuaded both to vote and then to vote for me and for people who agree with me. That is itself a project that we need to undertake. And I do think that it's very important that we have young candidates at the forefront of that, not older candidates trying to convince younger candidates to support us. So I think having an ambassador of sorts, somebody who is young, to go to other people, other peers, and say, it's not just about supporting me, but it's supporting our entire ticket of really, really great, devoted public servants who are running for re-election to judge or justice and who need your help. I think I contribute to that, to the ticket, and I'm excited to do so.
Cool. I'm so excited to talk to you and hear more about why you're running. I know we've briefly spoken on the phone months ago now, but it's really nice to touch base and to hear more about what you are doing with this race. I think that it's also really cool to hear, a young candidate who is yes, I am on TikTok and we are actively working on that. I personally resisted TikTok until we started this podcast this year, and it was well, now I have no choice. Now we must get on the short form video content. But it is clearly such a way to reach young potential voters, and I think we are really learning that for young voters, it's not just a choice between the couch and us, but it's three choices. It's the couch, us, or the opposition, and we gotta earn that vote or getting off the couch one way or the other.
In the last general election was inflation, and inflation prices impact young people the most. It impacts everybody, and I shouldn't say the most. Folks, retirees on fixed incomes are also really impacted by the increase in prices. But some of the biggest increase in prices are education, college, and housing, two things that young people are, laser focused on trying to achieve. And so when that is the number one issue and it impacts younger voters the most, it's, I'm not criticizing any particular person, but I think the Democratic Party has been tone deaf in saying young people just need to step up and knock on doors and make phone calls for us, and we'll just vote for us if they show up. And all they need to do is be reminded which day is Tuesday, and then we'll win an election. And I think is just not accurate. I think, young voters are voters like anybody else. They got to be persuaded that we are going to provide the type of relief that they need to live fulfilling lives, and are going to be good, especially on the court, good judges who understand the law and apply it fairly and care about all of the people who come before the court. They need to be convinced of that, just like every other voter needs to be convinced of that. And like any other group, the best person to provide that message, the best messenger, is somebody from the community. And so I think it's important that we have young candidates trying to make that message bring that message to a group that is increasingly the swing demographic in North Carolina elections.
Honestly, like I think you had it right saying like young folks are the most affected. I mean, it is true. Like the senior folks on fixed incomes also very affected, but it hits differently when you own your house than when you rent or when you just took out a $250,000 mortgage and can't downsize because there's not an option, available to you. And so I'm hard pressed to think of folks more affected than like those early career folks who are just trying to figure out what the rest of their life is going to look like.
Yeah, I went to
Um,
college. My wife and I went to UNC Asheville. That's where we met, and we loved the mountains. And I think probably if there had been an opportunity to stay in Asheville, we would have, and maybe the whole future looks very different. But Asheville is the type of place. I mean, everybody loves Asheville, and the whole region. And so people will go there to retire, or they will go there to work their last job. They're towards the end of their career. They can afford to take oftentimes a pay cut to move to Asheville, and they can afford, if they're moving from New York or California or something, they can afford to sell their apartment,
mhm.
take the cash, buy a house in Asheville, buy it outright. They don't have a mortgage. It prices out the younger people. And so, at least when I was there, I'm sure it's changed, but at least when I was there were a lot of people who were in their first job, waiting tables or something. And there were people in their last job, that they were going to work it until they're ready for retirement, and they were going to stay in Asheville. And those of us who were trying to build into our careers, very few of my friends from UNC Asheville were able to stay, even though a lot of us wanted to. And there's a whole nother, it's not just young people.
Mhm.
There's a whole article recently about Black Asheville, African Americans who lived in Asheville their whole lives. Oftentimes it's the next generation down, who move out and don't return. And there are any number of reasons for that, but a big one is affordability for all of us who are trying to build up our careers. And that's hard. And that's just one example. I love Asheville. I love to go back to Asheville. Of course, it's been rebuilding. And so we all need to go back up to the mountains and support everybody rebuilding there. But it affects Raleigh, it affects Durham and Charlotte, and it then ends up affecting all the communities around there. And we have a massive affordability problem. And there are ways that the court impacts that. Everything from, the affordability of our energy often ends up being directly impacted by our courts, to things like tow truck fees, something that you probably never even think about. But when your car gets towed, I can assure you, you think about it. We were renting a house in Raleigh, and there was some rule about parking your car on the street. We were renting. It was our front lawn, but we had our car out on the street, and we woke up one morning. I thought the car had been stolen. I started looking around for broken glass. It was a tow truck that had come in the middle of the night and taken all the cars, through some rule. And, when you're trying to figure out where your paycheck's going to go, and you have a sudden $400 expense, you care about those things. And the judges often will decide, whether regulations on tow trucks, for example, that try to limit those costs can go forward. And that's a Supreme Court case that came through, I think in 2014 or 2015, about how much the municipalities can regulate something as simple as tow truck fees. So affordability, it's a legislative issue. It is something that's impacted by our courts. And we have to be, if you care about affordability, you have to be very thoughtful about who you pick to be on our appellate courts.
That makes sense. Does the Court of Appeals like hear housing related stuff too?
Sure, there are any number of housing related cases. And the interesting piece is that, the courts decide cases and controversies. That's disputes, right? And so if you're a tenant and your landlord tries to evict you and you bring that into court, the trial court is deciding your rights with respect to your landlord. And so it's not that they're setting housing policy, it's that they're deciding a specific housing dispute. But when it gets into the appellate courts, the way that the court decides your case is going to impact everybody else in the state. And so I'll give you a more concrete example. I had a friend of mine, who was working a job that I knew exactly how much money he had, and it was not very much. It was a temp job. And he was renting an apartment in Wake County, which is already too expensive. And the apartment was filled with roaches. Disgusting. And he couldn't live there. So he and his partner moved out and got in a new apartment. But because they didn't want their credit ruined, they continued to pay both rents to try to maintain their credit, because they one day wanted to buy a house and they needed a car and all that kind of stuff. They kept telling the old landlord, like, we want our money back because we can't live in a place covered with roaches. So eventually, called me, and I signed on as their attorney, pro bono, just to help them out. And we were able to get them their money back. But that type of case, if it goes up on appeal, the way that the court decides that case ends up impacting everybody who then later has that same dispute. So if a court of appeals were to decide that a landlord is not obligated to keep the premises clean of bugs, then that's it for everybody. Everybody then lives in an apartment where they don't have a right to a clean apartment. On the flip side, if the court says, depending on the words of the contract, that the tenants have a right to have a landlord who will keep the common areas clean so that bugs don't get into their apartment, seems basic stuff. If a court of appeal decides that, then everybody in the state now has, depending on their circumstances, may have that right. And so, and that will continue into the future unless that decision is reversed or overturned. And so that's the stakes. And so absolutely, the court does not set housing policy, but the court decides housing cases. And depending on how it decides that case, it could impact a huge number of people in North Carolina. And that's what we have to be mindful about. And so somebody who hasn't rented in a long, long time, might not have the same perspective as someone who was younger and has rented an apartment in this, in recent times, and understands the costs associated with it. For a long time, somebody told me you got to have something like 30% of your income go to housing, right? Like rent or mortgage or utilities and so on. And at least for our family, when we were, building up our careers, that was preposterous. There was no way to limit the rent expense to that small portion.
Like maybe rent's 30 or 35, but that's just the rent and not all the other bills that go with it. Yeah, absolutely.
Imagine then you have to pay two of those because the landlord at one of them does not provide a habitable place to live, but is nevertheless charging you rent and threatening you with all kinds of legal action if you don't pay it. That's just an impossible situation. And so you've got to have access, and not everybody has access to a lawyer to fix that problem. And so you have to have judges who, if you go into court and you explain the circumstances, judges who have some sense of what that is like and are able to act on it. I think that's really important. And I think most voters think that's really important.
Yeah. It feels like it absolutely is. So this has been like incredibly enlightening. I think it's really clear that the appellate judges affect people's lives, and these decisions have very real impacts. You also sound like incredibly grounded and empathetic anyway, but like how would you keep yourself grounded and empathetic and human if elected to this role?
Yeah, it's really important. And I say it's really important because the job of an appellate judge is very different from the job of a trial court judge that we see on TV. Trial court judges are in court basically every day. Appellate judges are very rarely in court. Most of the job is to hide in your little chambers with a couple of recent law school graduates called clerks, and you read the materials and you study the law. You got to be a nerd. You got to be a law nerd to really do it well. You got to love dusty old books and a lot of internet research on legal research tools to get the right answer on the law. And that can be an isolating experience. And that can be an experience that then, especially the longer you have been in it, separates you from the people, the litigants, or the criminal defendants or whoever it is that's before the court. And so I think it's very important to do two things. First of all, that opinions have to be grounded in the facts of the case. That maybe seems obvious, but there have been a number of decisions that you could point to where the rule of law that comes out of the case doesn't really have anything to do with the facts of the case, and that the facts imagined in the opinion are not based on record evidence, but they're convenient to the outcome of the case. And so they are stuck in there. And I just think that that is contrary to my judicial philosophy. You have to be grounded in the facts of the case because these are real people with real lives, and those facts really do matter. So that's the first thing, is as a legal matter, you have to focus on the facts of the case. And then as a human matter, you have to be in community. North Carolina elects its judges, and there are downsides to that. I mean, I think it's hard I'm not sure that a group of non-lawyers, everyday citizens who do not spend a lot of time in court are always the best people to pick who our judges should be. But that's the system we have. And the advantage to having elected judges is that it forces judges to be in community with the people that they are making decisions about. And they're 8-year terms. So a judge could get elected and then take 7 years off and then try to run for re-election. But that's not who I am. And that's not an effective way to give back to the state. And so for me, it's about taking this time running for office to be very engaged in the community and be with real people who have ordinary, problems and talking to them, and then continue to do that after the election. Continue to be in community with people. Go to all the fairs and the school presentations and the soccer matches and all the rest of the things where you can interact with people and hear about what's going on in their lives. That doesn't necessarily impact the outcome of the case because the case is going to be driven by the facts and by the law. But there are any number of experiences recently with our courts where the courts really are trying to make a decision based on the real lived reality that people have, and oftentimes get it wrong, I think, because the judges aren't necessarily plugged in. Some of the recent U.S. Supreme Court cases about race the outcome has been driven by a belief that racism is basically over and that we just all need to move on. And I think that's hard for anybody, regardless of how you feel about those cases. I think it's hard for anybody who actually is in this real world with us and sees what life is like and interacts with people of all different backgrounds. I think it's hard for somebody who has that background to come to that conclusion in modern America. I think regardless of where you stand on either of those things, race is still a really problematic thing in America and in North Carolina. And that's just one of many examples of how, especially at the federal level, when judges have lifetime appointments and are paid, well, and have security and all these things that sort of separate them from everybody else, that can lead to some weird decisions that just don't reflect the lived reality of people. And that's something we have to avoid. So I'm committed to, before and after the election, being involved in the community, partly just because that's who I am.
Good deal. I love that. Yeah, I am so for, I would love for us to move towards Supreme Court, not just term limits, but we expand it to 13 and we tie expansion to the census. And I know that there is not political will for this, but I just find it so concerning, the current makeup of this court and how little we can do about it. I also please feel free to think about this and get back to me. But I think it would be so fun to have you back on and talk about 3, 4, 5, 8 of the court cases that really impact North Carolinians. And we don't you referenced Moore v. Harper. I know there was a voting rights case under Eric Holder that was a huge deal. I think it just could be a fun bit of content to break that down with you with the knowledge that you have.
I could do one right now if we still have time.
Yeah, sure, totally.
This is just another good example of how appellate courts work. So North Carolina a few years ago outlawed revenge porn. Accurate images. There's the fake stuff, and then there's recordings that were consensual at the time, but then either because of a breakup or because who knows why, one of the people involved then posts that all over the internet. It's called revenge porn. It's not always for that purpose, but often that's the reason, is that there's a breakup. One of the people is vengeful and uses those recordings to punish the person who's broken up with them. Sometimes it's in advance of a breakup. And, one of the people says, I want to break up. And the other one says, you can't leave me or I will post this stuff all over the internet. And it leads to really abusive relationships. It's not always the case, but almost always it is the man who is using, in a heterosexual relationship, a man using revenge porn to either punish a woman or trap a woman in an abusive relationship. So it was an important achievement when the legislature outlawed it. There was a man, I forget exactly where he was from, but who did this. He had it was a pretty abusive relationship, a violent relationship. And he, among other things, there was a sex tape that was consensual at the time, but that after the breakup, he sent to the victim's mom and to her friends and to her employer, tried to get her fired. Really, really terrible things. And he was arrested after like a year of this going on. He was finally arrested. The DAs put together a really compelling case and brought it to the jury, and a jury convicted him and said, you did this, and under the law, it's illegal, and you go to jail, which, prevented him from doing this anymore. And he appealed, and his argument on appeal was that the First Amendment, which protects speech, protects his right to post revenge porn, and that he should have been allowed, even he wasn't saying he didn't do it. He was saying, I did it, but it was protected. I should have been allowed to do it. The law that said it was illegal is unconstitutional. So on appeal, if the court had agreed with him, not only would he been let out of jail, but the whole state then, it would have been legal to post this stuff. That's how the appellate courts work, is that when it makes a decision in that one case, it impacts everybody else. And so it was my job as part of the Department of Justice to prevent that from happening. And that was my case. And there's extensive research and writing. We looked at all the other states that had revenge porn laws and what the courts had done in those cases. And then we brought it to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals will hear cases in judge panels. So you get 3 judges. And 2 of those judges are up for re-election, Judge John Arrowood and Judge Toby Hampson, who are fantastic. And I'm glad to say that I got to argue the case in front of them. And we won 3-0. The 3 judges on the panel all agreed that this person, what he did was not protected by the Constitution. And what he had, he was going to remain incarcerated and serve out the remainder of his sentence. And that was a really important decision for the whole state. And that's the type of thing that appellate courts have to do, is not just decide those narrow issues of law, is this protected by the Constitution or not, but think about how that decision will impact, men and women all across the country who in modern times, either because they made a mistake, in this case, the victim absolutely thought this was a mistake and she should not have been involved in that type of recording, very much regretted it, but it was something that happened. She didn't deserve to be treated that way. And there are all kinds of people in North Carolina that would have been adversely affected if the courts had gone the other way on that. So I'm very proud of that work, but that's just one very concrete example of how a different decision could have had a very different outcome for all kinds of people who could have been harmed by that type of stuff.
What a wild argument from a defendant on an appeal. Like, that seems very much like I am allowed to punch you because I can swing my arm through space and own it. Like, you can't, there seems like a level of harm there. Anyway, so glad you won that case. That seems yikes. All right, we're gonna switch gears real quick. Do you want to do a little like this or that with me, where I throw a couple of different things at you?
Sure,
and
that'd
you
be
gotta
great.
pick one. Cool. Okay, sweet tea or iced coffee?
Sweet tea. I am surprisingly not a coffee person.
Gotcha. Gotta get that sugar in somehow. The sweet tea will do it. From talking to you, I feel like I know the answer to this one now. But the mountains or the North Carolina coast?
That's tough. I just love the mountains. Every time we hit I-40 and can see them, we feel home. But I spent most summers out on North Carolina beaches, so I will plead the fifth on this one. It's North Carolina. We get both.
Gotcha. I feel like you probably got a little like Irish in your heritage too, Scotch Irish, and I feel like those of us with that in our blood find the Blue Ridge a little like home in some ways. It's delightful. Do you listen to more books or podcasts?
I listen to more podcasts. Usually I do a lot of reading for work. And so I love reading, but if I'm listening to something, it's usually a podcast.
Gotcha. If you had to pick a cookout side, hush puppies or cheese curds or something else?
Between the two hush puppies, although my cookout sides are usually a chicken quesadilla and Cajun fries.
Nice. Are you a voting early or an on election
Early.
day kind of person? More into the listening or into the talking?
Probably have to admit I'm into talking, although I try to be a very good listener.
Are you into a crispy fall morning or like a sunshiny summer day?
Fall is absolutely my favorite season.
I'm right there with you. Business formal or business casual?
I feel like those have really merged. I'll go with business casual, because that's usually how I dress. Although nowadays, the number of people who are actually in business formal, unless I'm in court, because almost nobody ends up in business formal anymore.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, mustard or vinegar-based barbecue?
No. Between those, vinegar-based for sure. Mustard, that's a South Carolina question. No way. Now, between North Carolina flavors, I will again plead the fifth. But I'll take North Carolina barbecue over South Carolina barbecue any day.
No, there's some good mustard-based barbecue out there in the East, but
I guess. Well, if it's North Carolina mustard-based barbecue, I would certainly give it a shot. But yeah, nothing from South Carolina.
Good deal. Well, thank you so much for doing this with me. I know you mentioned you're on TikTok. Can you share your handle with us or where people can find you? I know you're at whalen4nc.com and
yeah, that's
other
the easiest
places.
thing. Whalen, WHALEN, 4FORNC, North Carolina, NC.com is the best place to find everything. You can sign up to volunteer there. We are in desperate need of volunteers. It's a huge state. And there's no way for me to meet everybody. So we've got to have people who understand the importance of this race and can share that information. There's also a big red donate button. If you've got the funds to support the campaign, we've got the same statewide electorate that everybody else has, but we're not going to be able to raise the out-of-state money that a lot of people raise for statewide elections or even some of the big in-state money. And so we need to be able to raise money from people who understand the importance of our courts. And then all of the social media links are there. And so please do go on and find us on everything.
Awesome. Yeah, I just talked to the Vote Save America people about the Court of Appeals races this week and your race and Christine and why it should get some support. So I'm hoping that yields something good. Cool. Thank you. I'm not going to make you sit through the little outro that I will record for the end of this episode.
Foxfire rising under the night sky, burning out the lies that kept us high and dry. Brick by brick, the old walls fall away. Time to rise and start a new day.
I was so glad to talk to James today. James Whalen, everybody, thank you for listening. I felt like he gave us really thoughtful answers. And I think it's cool that he is somebody who is stepping up at this really critical moment in North Carolina's courts. I know he said it, but one more time. If you want to learn more about James Whalen's campaign, his vision for reforming our appellate courts, or how to get involved to help him get elected, head to whalen4nc.com and follow his campaign on social media. In terms of a closing kind of call to action for today, times are hard, y'all. This Republican shutdown just ended, but that doesn't mean the harm from it is not like definitely still happening with folks on SNAP and folks who haven't gotten paychecks or have been laid off as a result. Please participate in mutual aid to whatever extent that you are able to this month. Maybe that is dropping off a donation or a check at your local soup kitchen or mutual aid network or ministry. If you're looking for somewhere to send those donations, I am specifically recommending ACIM, which is Area Congregations in Ministry, a Granville County nonprofit that provides food and home goods to folks in need. But I'm sure there's also somewhere in your area as well. And thank you for joining us for the Foxfire Dispatch. If today's discussion lit a spark, help us fan the flame by sharing this episode with your neighbors, dropping us a note on social, or emailing us at thefoxfiredispatch@gmail.com with your questions, stories, and ideas for bringing about a better South. We put out episodes on Fridays, and if you like our content, you can find us at the Foxfire Dispatch on Instagram, YouTube, and Blue Sky, and Foxfire Dispatch at TikTok and Twitter, aka The Bad Place. We would be especially thrilled if you would subscribe to us on YouTube. If you enjoy this type of deep dive political conversation, your support helps more people hear it. Until next time, remember, we are who we're waiting for. Now go get in some good trouble. Our music is produced by John Fitz. The Foxfire Dispatch is written and executive produced by me, Liz Purvis.